Hi, good evening and welcome to the Graduate School of Architecture Practice Lecture Series 2025. I'd like to welcome everybody. As many of you know, we've been running this series for the last 4 years, and every year we invite a number of practitioners to come to this event to talk about their practices. We started it during COVID, and it was a very effective and successful model and way of communicating. And so we've continued it to this year. And my name is Mark Raymond, and I'm the director of the Graduate School of Architecture. So this year we have 6 or 7 presentations, and you'll be able to track those presentations through our social media channels, and advising you of the time and when they're going to take place, what date they're going to take place. The other thing to mention is, whilst it's not being presented in the presentation here, these are CPD events. And at the end of the presentation, we will post a link that you'll be able to follow, and that way you'll be able to register for CPD points, and you will be sent the documentation to certify your attendance. So for those of you who want to use this for CPD, please make sure that you do that. We have had instances in the past where people have said, I've attended all of them, please can you provide a certificate, but we do need to verify your attendance here, so the link will be provided at the end of the session. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the practice lecture series and what we try and do with them. So I think we're all familiar with the kind of monographic or typical type of lecture that an architect might give at a school of architecture or a public lecture, where they would talk about their work, their projects. They would show images of their projects and speak about the history of those projects and the form and nature of those projects and their approach to their work. And that's a very successful model of presenting architectural lectures. What we've tried to do in the practice lecture series is to invite practitioners who may or may not be architects. They're generally a majority of architects who present, but they always represent people who occupy what we consider to be a kind of interesting or provocative or sometimes unusual place or space within creative practice generally, that very often, but not always, has a very specific link to the production of architecture. And the idea is to encourage practitioners to talk about the way that they work, how they do what they do, rather than showing the product of what they do. So we get an insight into the practice, into how the practice works, what the motivations are. Often practitioners will talk about their own formation, their own education, and how that education has brought them to practice. Sometimes they share working drawings or sketches. Sometimes they might share images of their offices. But it's really an opportunity for us to get a kind of look behind the scenes, a kind of unplugged version of the practice. And we have, as I say, this series an interesting array of practitioners. The next presentation will be on the 10th of June by Lorata Bereng. We'll give you some more information about that at the end of this session. She is a director of the Stevenson Gallery and works in the world of art, as Stephen does. But we thought it would be interesting to have, as I said, a diverse range of practitioners starting the series this year with Stephen's work. So I met Stephen when I first visited the GSA in 2018, 7 years ago, when I came to visit for the Visiting International Critics Week, as it was then called, what we now call Architecture Week. And he was a critic alongside myself and other architects, and I was really impressed by his insight and his perspective on architecture. I was aware that he was not an architect, but I was very surprised and impressed by his insight into the work that was taking place. He's been a regular critic at the school. He's regularly invited by units to student presentations to review the work of students, and I think brings a very interesting and astute view of architecture and architectural practice that I think brings great value to the school. So he's a friend of the school, an ally of the school, and I'm really appreciative of him agreeing to participate in this and share some of his work. Some of you may have read about may know Stephen, but may also have read about his work in the social media posts that we have used to promote this, and I'll just go through that to contextualize the talk this evening. Stephen's work has been underpinned by three core areas of interest: architecture and the built environment, art and war, and anatomy and the body. Johannesburg, his hometown, has served as a critical reference point for his artistic insights into the apartheid city turned African city, with a particular interest in the impact of defensive urban planning and architecture on the behavioural aspects of city and society. Printmaking, model making, video and photography serve as foundations for large-scale installations and commissions, while simultaneously offering audiences access to a variety of editioned and serialised works. Much of this effort has been facilitated through close collaboration with David Krut Projects in South Africa and New York. He holds a BAFA honours degree from WITS, is a fellow of the Ampersand Foundation, a co-director of the transdisciplinary artist collective The Trinity Session, and a visiting critic at the Graduate School of Architecture here at the University of Johannesburg. He's held numerous solo exhibitions in South Africa and abroad, and has participated in residencies in North America, Europe, and Africa. His work can be found in public and private collections in South Africa, Europe, and the USA. Today, he said he's going to be sharing reflections on his art school training and how his third-year painting major gave way to his interest in the phenomenological aspects of buildings and space, explored through his honours year, and how these early learnings have helped align his transdisciplinary approach to urbanism and art making. So we're looking forward to the presentation, and I'd like to let you know that if you have any questions or if you have any comments about what Stephen is presenting, please put them in the chat. When we're finished, when he is finished, we will open the floor and we'll invite any questions or comments or thoughts or reflections that you may have on the work. And often those can be very valuable, the sessions at the end after the presentation. So I'd encourage you all, whilst you're listening, to, if you have any thoughts, to take note, drop them in the chat, or I will invite you at the end to speak and pose the questions directly. Sometimes people are a little shy to do that. If you are shy, put them in the chat, but if you're not, you just put your hand up. I'll respond to you. I'll keep them all in sequence, and then you can ask questions to Stephen directly, or make a comment on his work, or react to the work in whatever way you would like. So now I'm going to hand over to you, Stephen. The floor is yours, and we're looking forward to what I'm sure is going to be a very stimulating and insightful presentation this evening. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mark, and thanks to you and your team for supporting this process and putting it all together this evening. I feel like I'm in good hands, so let's get on with it. Quick survey of the art school experience. So I graduated, I finished in '93 and started my career in 1994, but I want to backtrack to third year and then to fourth year just to set the tone for some ways of thinking. So I'm going to start with these two images. The process underpinning the creation of these images was informed by the brief from my lecturer at the time, the very famous Penny Siopis. She gave us envelopes. Within each of the envelopes were a series of pictures and a series of texts, and we were free to simply plot a composition in response to sort of the relational logics and aesthetics of those images. So I'm not going to go into any detail around the meaning of these things, except to say that often when we think about approaching a surface, an image, the translation of an idea, it's quite fascinating to, or I found it fascinating to jolt my own perspectives and to shift them in strategic ways. So in this case, this would very much be drawing from the field of surrealism and Dadaism, where chance played a very, very important part in meaning making, in the construction of a narrative, if you will, or often a deliberately nonsensical message to an audience and a critique of the times, the First World War era in particular. So this image on the left-hand side, again, this is not going to show how it was made, but a lot of the mark making on this particular image was produced as a result of the light filtering into my studio. So a combination of light and shadow populated the surface of the board, which then seemed appropriate to incorporate, given that I was working already in a very abstract language. So or abstract visual system. And immediately that business of seeing, the kind of opticality of image making became very resonant for me. And in a way, painting served as a platform to segue from painting altogether and actually start to make more sense of my sense of self within the studio and sense of place within, I suppose, a creative agenda or a creative project. And so the image on the right, made around about the same time, is really the studio scrapings of my colleagues and so forth, kind of a relishing of the idea that a studio scraping might well be the source code for a new proposition. But here I'm kind of owning it in a way. And I'm also responding to the spatial conditions of the studio themselves in the form of the glass box. So I went to art school at the Wedge, but most of you will know it as the Origin Center. And in my fourth year, I had this, we were all moved, the fourth years were moved downstairs to a basement space within the complex. And one got wind of a couple of interesting issues. The first was that there was a sort of legend around the fact that this was a toxic waste dumping site. I had been witness to animal experimentation in a lab that sat above this space, and there's a certain amount of psychological trauma that came with making my final year exhibition. So the images that you see here are basically snapshots of particularly the two images on the left, the outside space, and the images on the right, the two on the right, of the interior. And just working with the emulsion of the photograph and scratching it off, I start to kind of draw in a direct way in response to the space, a much more tactile way of engaging with the views and the perspectives and the angularity, the tectonic of the environment, than simply just making drawings. Around my mid-year, things got a little pressurizing, and I had a nervous breakdown as a consequence of a lot of stress and pressure, and burst a blood vessel in my head, what's known as a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And in a way, this was a very, very important shift for me, because a lot of the perceptual stuff that I was really interested in and exploring physically through material and so forth became a bit of a challenge from mid-year for about 2 months, because the swelling behind my brain was so severe that that I had double vision that lasted for the greater part of 2 months, which then caused the obvious kind of business of having to imagine how you might work with visibility and then in a tactile way. I wasn't blind, I could see, but in a way it kind of set me free of a two-dimensional surface, I suppose. So these are a series of installation shots from my final exhibition, and they range from everything from creating a fire installation in the top left to organizing all the detritus in the alleyway into some form of a composition, to celebrating the slabs removed and so forth. I won't go into great detail, but maybe just conclude with the bottom right-hand image. One's always thinking about what one has learned, where one came from. I'd finished high school, of course. This was now my final year of university. I started growing my hair in high school. In the image bottom right, you'll see a glass box with my ponytail that had been cut off at the base. And next to that, my school blazer. There was a kind of, you get very self-reflexive when you're in art school and trying to think about your own life story and what has influenced you. And in a way, it was quite interesting to think about ways of collecting aspects of myself and presenting that as objects, as sculpture, as concepts. One of the things that was really important to me was responding to the etiquette of my lectures at the time. And there was a kind of culture amongst some lecturers of boozy lunches, and anticipating the fact that they may arrive late to my exam, I wanted to play with the idea of an object that might be gone as a consequence of their late arrival. So I installed two glass plates, steel plates, in fact, cast blocks of ice, placed them on top and let them melt. And indeed, much of it was gone by the time they came to respond to my exam. Ironically, of course, an architect who collected ephemeral work at the time heard of this installation, and to this day continues to honor the steel plate. I might get into collector's rules a little bit later. I was very, very fortunate when I finished in 93. Obviously, I graduated in 94, and I was approached to run the Market Theatre Gallery, which was in its phase of reinvention. This is 1994. We'd just come out of a cultural boycott. There wasn't a history of There had been a hiatus in programming the gallery up until 1994 due to a kind of waiting game around what the outcome of our politics would be, and the shift from an us and them narrative to an us and us narrative. So in a way, the market theatre was a very important resistance and kind of political space for me to learn about the way in which artists had responded, particularly from the 70s through to the 80s, to the apartheid era, and the archive of the gallery extended back to 1977 when it was founded. So this was a really fabulous way to get in touch with a very recent art history. But more broadly, the market theatre complex is part of a former vegetable market. It wasn't a theatre to begin with. And directly outside of it is the sort of iconic Mary Fitzgerald Square. So there was a lot about this context of Newtown, about Johannesburg or Newtown as a cultural mecca in the early 90s, that forged a lot of my thinking around public realm, around practicing in the public realm, and where the exchange of creativity was really taking place, and that was sitting between cultural spaces and outdoor spaces. I suppose I set myself a somewhat ridiculous challenge, and that was I became fascinated with history and heritage on the city of Johannesburg, based on the fact that we all pretty much know it shouldn't exist in the first place were it not for the discovery of gold. I kind of set about this mad task of wanting to collect every book that had ever been written or published on the city. And the images on the right detail a selection of books from my collection of about 500, 600 books, shown at my recent survey show at the Wits Art Museum, where I tell a story about my version of Johannesburg up until 1994. So I'm going to move quite quickly through a series of images that speak about the kind of conscious thinking about the creation of my own visual language in response to the city that I'm discovering post-1994. It's pretty obvious. Black South Africans, people of color, have full access to the city, relatively speaking, not necessarily from an economic, but there are many barriers to access, of course. But in the main, we see a radical transformation starting earlier than 1994, but to be immersed in that condition was really, really powerful and potent in terms of thinking about the production of culture within city spaces, within urban environments, and how the market theatre might push and pull that exchange through my work as a curator and a manager and engage with artists. So I worked a lot in photography and video in those days, and driving the city was an integral part of the experience of the city. And so a series of collages emerge out of this, a kind of contradiction about spatial perception, about my being in that space, but also being perhaps an interlocutor of some kind. And based on these are screen grabs from a video called Flash Motion in Bree. I'm referring to Bree Street in Newtown, now known as Lillian and Goy Street. And I became fascinated by this business of the tension between the sort of industrial capitalist modernist grid and the tension that we see on the street, where people feel no need to observe that grid in any formal sense. So the beginnings of a kind of waywardness piques my interest in terms of the disruptive value that offers to challenging the grid. And a series of images emerge out of this. I walked the city a lot. In those days, it was very easy to walk the city with your camera. You weren't stopped like one is today, where you'll have a security guard asking you why you're taking a photograph of the building. It's private property. There's an irony in that, of course. But I became particularly interested in the furtiveness of the modernist city reflected in its modernist facades, and how that might suggest a visual metaphor for urban transformation. And then there's a corollary to that, a light camouflage series, if you will, the way in which light will bounce off those glass curtain walls. And in some instances, there are messages that are completely abstract, but have the potential to mean something. I won't state the obvious, but the image on the right might have a kind of obvious reference to text from another place. And then this rather large triptych referred to as Citizens of the Mirage City, and that was very much, I think, the perception of Johannesburg in those days. People were really, really afraid to come to the city center. Of course, we were a democracy, but people were not. A lot of white business had left the city by this stage. Black people were occupying the city. A lot of buildings became quite quickly slummed. A lot of illegal occupation, all that kind of stuff. So in the main, unless you were regularly traversing that environment, it was better just to avoid it. And to that extent, it became interesting to me that it didn't exist on another level as well. And these images, which are intentional inversions of the image so that the shadow becomes the predominant body, is part of that play on seeing, unseeing, peripheral vision, fear, what lurks behind you, and so forth. And then this business of driving, looking at the patterns of the patterns of reflections within the grid, within the glass curtain, experiencing the urban grid through driving, through a kind of challenge of navigating jaywalkers in inverted commas. It became important to me to reflect on the idea of all of this function in the first place. It seems that the city seems to behave better through the will of the people, rather than all of this rigidity and organization and kind of economization of space. The new users of the city have their way of engaging, designing, and producing new value for themselves. So what came out of this was, really, do we need to have road markings and traffic lights and signage that dictates our behavior, both in terms of cars and bodies? And so I wasn't able to execute it in Johannesburg due to all kinds of logistical reasons, but during a solo exhibition in Cape Town, a city very accustomed to closing down its spaces, I was able to get straight to the council and get a permit to block the road off for the night so that we could erase the immediate road markings and then host a parallel parking competition. And for anybody who takes pride in the parallel parking competition business knows where that's coming from, to find a gap in parking spaces in the city of Johannesburg, which at this stage, in the early 90s, I think there was a total of 5,000 open area parking bays. So I think it's an urban sport we can all relate to, for those of us who drive. So there's a couple of really important moments that have introduced to me and the thematics or interests that I've sustained over the last 30 years. And the first, or 20 odd years, the first would be a research trip to Dar es Salaam in 2001 for the Trinity session. And this is the scaffolding erected to do remedial work on the exterior of a 4- or 5-star hotel I was staying in at the time. The ingenuity of this construction, and at the same time a perceived precarity, was very, very attractive to me, and a very embodied form of construction and spectacle was just was quite awe-inspiring as form and as object and as sculpture, as build. Shortly after that, we were doing Trinity session, was doing a residency in Normandy, and one of the artists we were working with took us down to the D-Day beaches in Normandy. And this was the first time I had a kind of physical encounter with Hitler's Atlantic Wall, which comprised some 3,500 defensive installations, cannon bunkers, machine gun nests, you name it, spanning all the way from Norway down to the Mediterranean. Quite a phenomenal feat in terms of defensive planning. And then, of course, the spectacle of construction itself. City of Johannesburg has undergone so much revision, so much transformation, that at one point, certainly leading up to 2010, the entire place was a construction site. And we're always curious to know about what's coming next. And yet, for me, this is the moment that I'm most interested in. I'm less interested in the finished product. No offense to Paragon Architects and the German company that worked on this project. Sorry for the shocking image, but this is part of the real stuff. I was born hydrocephalic, which means I have, if you look at the image top left, I have a shunt in my head that drains excess cerebrospinal fluid to avoid inflammation and brain damage. The image bottom left is a titanium screw that's fused a bone in my right foot. And the image right, I think, is 2012. Scar adhesions have built up in my gut as a result of the fluid that drips from the catheter and the shunt, etc., etc. And I was rushed to hospital to have a laparotomy. So waking up at 3:30 in the morning to this kind of a scar, and the learnings that came from how in a way to live with this kind of condition have been very, very influential in the way that I look at vulnerability within space, vulnerability within certain types of conditions, not necessarily me being a vulnerable person, except apart from the fact that I have obviously spent a lot of my time contemplating when I might die. So I think these things are connected to cities collapsing, cities decaying, cities reimagining, cities fortifying, cities rebuilding. There are correlations for me obviously at a hyperconceptual and metaphoric level. So I try from time to time to find ways to consolidate these language systems that might be manifestos that I can refer to, into my own private little manifestos that I can refer to in terms of the configuration or organization of information and ideas, both in a two-dimensional and in a spatial or three-dimensional way, and perhaps more. So this business of looking for the one really presents itself in 2010 via my project JAG-SNAG, which takes place and studies the Johannesburg Art Gallery. I've been looking for a ruin, if you will, for quite some time in the spirit of Gordon Matter Clark's work. I'd been looking for a building that was in a state of neglect, had interesting program, and I could intervene within a kind of strategic, tactical way. I was very lucky to bend the arm of the then, she's now late, Antoinette Murdoch, the director of the museum, who, when I presented the proposition to her, she said, "So you basically want to kind of embarrass me and the condition of the institution?" I said, "Well, that might be what I'm doing, but actually I'm interested in something a little bit more refined." The timing was such that they were about to launch the catalogue of 100 years of collecting in 2010, and the gallery itself would turn 100 years in 2014, 2015. So I'm not going to go into much of the history around Johannesburg Art Gallery. We know it's a failing cultural institution within our city, but perhaps one of the key factors contributing to its demise was the creation of the Noord Street taxi rank, which just sits close to Johannesburg Art Gallery and makes its way all the way here. And so what starts to happen is the densification of traffic and taxis at that point already. I think we're dealing with the 90s at that point, or maybe earlier, completely disrupts the experience of the streetscape and turns many of the very white and very elite patrons of that time away from the city centre, and particularly from the Johannesburg Art Gallery. But it's an interesting building, and I think if we start with the image top left, the building was designed by Edwin Lutyens. He was based in India at the time of the construction of the building. He was working on other projects for the Empire. And the first problem with the siting of the building is that it is positioned the wrong way around. It's positioned south-facing instead of north-facing. Lutyens wasn't thinking about where he was living in the world. So the image bottom left, we see by the 1930s, you have the east and west wings extended, and the image right is the modern extension in 1986 under construction. The gallery, in a way, was already in trouble by the 1960s. It wasn't performing to the expected standard, and it was up for sale with a number of propositions. The one that interested me the most was that it was perhaps going to become Johannesburg's foremost eye research center, which is kind of interesting and ironic simultaneously, because what is art if not about the business of seeing and perceiving? So these kinds of archival reference points were really, really a nice way to start getting into the folly that the building was, perhaps from the day that the cornerstone was laid. Now, one of the biggest problems with the 1986 extension was the quality of the materials that didn't last very long and led to or increased water penetration to the extent that the extended part of the 86 version had been shut down on regular occasions. And this for me was very exciting. I'm interested in a body in a state of decay, and I'm interested in that at a textural level. I'm interested in every single one of the penetration points. And so for a period of about a year, we snagged the entire building. I brought on various specialists, friends, architects, heritage specialists, etc., documented as much as I could of the building, just to start understanding just how vulnerable both the sandstone material was, how the assets within the facility were at stake, but also, in a way, reveling in the fact that this was life on life's terms for a building that in some ways was becoming increasingly out of place. During the snagging process, I was very happy to come across the competition model that Mayor Pienaar produced for the 86 extension. And I asked permission to be able to work with it as an installation object. So leading up to the 2010 event, I asked if I could produce some sort of intervention on the exterior of the building. And this is typically the way that I draw and plot scenarios for play. What's really nice is the central sculptural object, of course, is a Eduardo Villa sculpture. He was still alive at the time of me producing this project, and he was very, very accepting of my idea to kind of drape it and turn it into some sort of a projection surface. So this is the intervention that takes place for the launch of the catalogue to celebrate 100 years of collecting. And working in parallel, you know, historically I haven't had conventional studio environments. It's not true. I have a workspace. I'm talking to you from one tonight, and I've had many studios over the years, but I've never approached studio practice in the conventional sense of I'm walking into the room every single day and I'm going to work on painting number 5 or object number 3 or whatever, and I've got them, they all surround me like a family of children in a stage of development. I tend to often make work on the run in situ, and in situ means the public realm or the building that I'm in at the time. But I've had this remarkable sort of parallel universe in David Krut Projects and publishing, where I've been able to make books, etchings, prints, and the like. So the image to the right is paper on the top reflecting into a polished copper plate that then produces this image. And if you look at the sort of quadrant top right, you might notice the Lutjens' gardens, if you will, for the Johannesburg Art Gallery, that circular target-like steering wheel image. This piece is entitled Replication of the Earth's Surface. But what's particularly important for me is it's an optical representation of gridlock. So if you look at the image long enough, or in the right way, you will start to see gray dots bouncing around at the intersections. And that's just the function of the sort of contrast tension between the white and the black. But this is very much picking up on that experience of driving the city in my city golf and having all kinds of encounters. So these things get upcycled for me. I start to want to understand how I can immerse myself in that abstracted condition of the city. And Space A became available to me for the entire duration of the project, the entire 5-year duration. But for the first 2 years, it was a meeting point. It was a presentation space. I recycled it every 4 months with new material. And here we see the installation itself from my dear friend Thuresh Govinder, whom some of you are more than familiar with. And finally putting it on a decent base and starting to bring the model in relation to the city. During the time, the room that leads into the Space A room is the Lutjens Kunstkamer, or the Lutjens Art Room, which had 2 sort of classical sculptural pieces on the left-hand side there. In the middle is fingerprint dusting from SAPS, and we see the sculptures gone on the right-hand side. So there've been numerous incidents of theft at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, and one could go into that and why. What I'm more interested in is the room became redundant for a short space of time, which allowed me to be able to start making some provocations within the space, drawing from experiences and travels in Africa, and starting to think about accessing the building in other ways. Quite literally, how can this tower lead one up to that light point, to that clear story? It's a sort of aspirational gesture, but it's also a framing device that leads us into Space A and shifts the austerity, I think, of that grey sandstone and starts to create a dynamism there. Now, this project was as much about making installations and murals and objects and so forth as it was a very serious engagement with the history of the building, and how there might be new responses to the fixes that needed to be done. And I call it seeding radical heritage. And sorry to correct you, Mark, but a year prior to us meeting, I had been co-leading Unit 11 with Sumaya Valley, which was titled Radical Heritage. And I think that, in a way, this body of work served as some of the underpinnings for the way that we approached our unit in 2017. But here I have a range of journalists, architects, design specialists, students, and so forth, all responding to the challenge at hand. And we made this very public. We called on the public. We toured them of the condition of the building, and in order to solicit responses. And to the right-hand side, you see Francois Pina sitting with his hand on his chin. And I was quite astonished that he was happy to join us for the morning and offer support as a result of this. I was worried that he might perceive my work as an attack on his firm's work itself, but it was really a very important kind of acknowledgement of what needed to be done. So part of what I was looking for, this business of looking for a ruin or looking for an incomplete or a collapsing situation, was so that I could test some aesthetics and actually practice in a pseudo kind of architectural pseudo construction way. I'd asked permission of Antoinette to actually tear apart parts of the 1986 extension that had been kind of walling off and concealing parts of the building, reducing light into the space and so forth. So I kind of set it up as a construction site to begin with, and this is my sort of project plan, if you will. And then we go about letting the light in. And quite literally working at this level of kind of physicality was also a very important way of thinking beyond the painted surface. Those early paintings are quite diminutive. They're small. They're to the scale of my hand. But when one prepares the surface, the textures on those canvases, to allow for mark making to appear in situations that aren't deliberate. I'm now going to paint a face, but rather I'm going to allow paint to bleed into a textured surface that I've created that then solicits a new image, is very much the thinking behind that way of mark making. And I consider this approach mark making as well. And I don't mean literally the spray paint. During this process, the building flooded from the basement up, and the water came up into this foyer atrium area, which was quite phenomenal. I was not allowed to share this photograph with anybody at the time. It was a very embarrassing moment, and yet a very still pond inside a building, contributing to moisture and potentially threatening the artworks in the basement below. So these are just some shots of the intervention. It's the interventions themselves. The reflected water you saw previously is now projected onto a screen that you access by climbing over and through what was previously boarded off. The areas that had experienced serious water damage and ceiling collapse are then kind of bolstered in a particular way. This is playful on the one hand, and not actual kind of remedial construction work. Although a lot of people visiting the exhibition thought that this was where was the labor, where was the work being done to fix this environment. So I was really interested in the tension between something really functional, something aesthetic, something potentially performative, something that reflects on absence, etc. And to the left is an animated version of the replication of the Earth's surface, which I showed you earlier. It was really exciting for me to be able to just work with a huge amount of space. So in a way, I was occupying the museum or the gallery as a studio space and being very intentional about exposing the materiality of the building and the material that I was engaging with in that material process. My father at the time was working with an American company called Foamlock. I can hear some sound leaking in there. So at the time, my father was working with a company called Foamlock. They're an American company. They use polyurethane foam as a waterproofing medium, as an insulation medium, as a soundproofing medium, and so forth. So I thought it might be interesting to produce a series of sculptures that would capture the water coming out, leaking through the ceiling. And of course, there's always room for a mind map. Again, something co-produced with Suresh Govinda, a conversational piece, something to prompt other opportunities for engagement. The two of us riffing on what the space might mean to us, what working in the space represents, etc., etc. Very happy that I was able to collaborate with Alexander Opper from UJ Archie School. These are his master students, if I'm not mistaken. That's correct. Who set about doing a project on the state of the Johannesburg Art Gallery. That also extended to a whole bunch of ideas that have existed around the railway tracks and decking directly from the south end of the gallery over the railway tracks, expanding the buildable footprint of the city and so forth. So having an architectural world in my space has often been infinitely more potent for me than an art world. No disrespect to my colleagues and friends out there. I'm not sure who's listening from that world right now. Then a nod to Lutjens' drawings, which are quite beautiful. These are low-res photographs. I can't go in much further. And then the model itself. And probably, I think, one of the most important acknowledgements within the installation is the condition of the gallery from an operational point of view. At the time that I was working, there was, I don't know, I didn't bother counting, but I think there's some 50-odd posts at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, of which something like 25, 50% at least, if not more, were frozen at that time. So you're not just dealing with a decaying building, you're dealing with a beleaguered infantry, if you will. So those two sides of the engagement with the building really started to get me in close contact with just the challenges that the staff had on a daily basis, that kind of burden of the crisis of managing a collapsing environment, which holds some of the most precious pieces of historical and contemporary art in the country. And I'm going to end with, am I going to end here? I'll see. This little bottom clip in the Jag-Snag key to fix Joburg's historic landmark was one of a few reviews that I got, but this one was particularly catalytic. Of course, I find the page that it lands on very charming, but more than that, this little piece of text was picked up by people that sit within a dedicated committee that looks at building assets within the city. They're not Joburg Property Company, they're not Joburg Housing, they sit within a different division. And I wasn't present for it, but I believe about 50-odd persons descended on the museum with Antoinette Murdoch guiding them, showing them my installation, all of them in shock and horror, not so much whether it's art or not, but clearly he's exposing the building and this is an embarrassment to us. And what was particularly poignant and potent at the time was that one of the members was wheelchair bound and the lifts weren't working. So this set about a task team that sought to raise some serious money to fix the building. And that money came, the contractors went, they didn't finish their work, they weren't qualified or specialized in heritage renovation work. And the other side of the and is if we look at what's going on within various committees of the sort of higher echelons of the art world, there's a desperate kind of move to move the collection out of the building and the building perhaps to become something else. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen. What an insight. I don't think I've had the experience of you kind of talking through your work like that. So it's really very insightful for me. Yeah, and you touched upon, I think, some quite interesting intersections with architecture and the way that the work relates to the city. And work feels really quite grounded in that way. I'd like to open in the chat group. We've just got messages from an AI assistant, which is rather sinister, but we're not supposed to have those. But yeah, but I'd like to open up to anybody who'd like to ask a question. If you could just raise your hand, and if you'd like to, you can either type it in if you don't feel like speaking, but it would be nice to hear any voices. Any responses to Stephen's presentation? Anything? Any questions that anybody has for him, or is there anything anybody would like to share about the work? I can see that Lee Hutton has a hand up. Lee, would you like to go ahead and share your question?
Good evening, everyone. I would like to know, Stephen, please, how did you manage to fund this? Or did you just do this, just carried on with it? Or what was the financial implications of this project of yours? Please, thank you.
I was, they were able to give me 100,000 Rand, which pretty much spread over, I think, in the initial phases, in the very beginning, it was very makeshift. So wherever there were resources within the gallery, we draw on those resources, but I don't remember any hard cash, maybe just money to recoup a basic expenditure. And then Antoinette could justify something to the tune of about 100,000 for the final installation that happened in 2014, 2015, but all of it had to be spent on materials and sort of capital aspects of the work as opposed to paying myself a fee. So basically I did this, I didn't earn any money from doing it. And that was intentional. This was an opportunity for me to work on scale and to create my own program and to extend that into a broader field of interest and inquiry about the city of Johannesburg, using, in this case, JAG as the lens to look at the contradictions, the dysfunctionality, and the fundamental challenges between the kind of colonial and post-colonial condition that this building was in crisis around. So, but you have to remember, not that this is necessarily a way to, or I should mention, not that you would remember, we created the Trinity session in 2000, 2001. This is a collective that was initially formed by myself and Marcus Newstetter and Catherine Smith. And we were consulting to the city of Johannesburg on large-scale public art installations. So essentially, I was very fortunate. I had a salary, and that was through my consultancy. So it afforded me the opportunity to take these kinds of liberties with my time and my creative process. But ultimately, this was a unique opportunity, and I wasn't gonna step away from it, no matter what the cost, personal cost.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Lee. Jackie LaRue asks, from being at Varsity and working mostly alone, how important is the group of people you now have around you to work with and share ideas? And I'll just repeat that for clarity. From being at Varsity and working mostly alone, how important is the group of people you now have around you to work with and share ideas?
Well, first I should clarify that if I suggested I was alone, that was a misrepresentation, but I'll just qualify. In my studio, downstairs in that basement space with all of the psychosis and everything, I was surrounded by painters. And I was supposed to be a painting major, but I'd rejected that and started making objects and responding to the space directly. So maybe I was alone because there was a tension in the language system that was operating in that space. But these were great friends, and they remain friends of mine today. But the people I surround, the company I'm privileged to keep today ranges mostly, funnily enough, it's architects, obviously a tremendous amount of artists and curators and all that kind of stuff. But I have a lot of, by definition, I collaborate. Obviously I make a lot of singular works, and that's the result of my labor and my hand. But ultimately, I'm much more interested in a kind of dialogical practice. Interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary is really, really important for me. I think I learned that the moment, one started doing your sort of art history component to your degree, and then in 1993, we had what was known as, as critical theory or something we were learning in our fourth year in 93. And it was the beginning of thinking, not quite post-colonial, but it was critical thinking. And I think that I've completely lost that's what I wanted to say about the interdisciplinary. I was fascinated through following art history and taking film theory and I started making my own films. I was fascinated by philosophy, sociology, economics. My goodness, there are so many disciplines that feed off of the art historical and the art making world through which art provides a lens for the reading of those disciplines as well. So in a way, the moment I entered into the city of Johannesburg, it seemed to me, as a manager, as an artist, as a curator, whatever, it seemed to me that the way of thinking and making was always going to be in some notional sense of a collective.
Great, thanks for that, Stephen. And then we have another question, slightly longer question from Joanne Fredericks, who is a master's student here at the GSA. And she says, hi, I'm Jo. I'm currently exploring Johannesburg as a layered palimpsest in my architectural thesis, using printmaking, collage, and surrealism as a way to engage with memory and trauma embedded in space. I'm also working on intervening in the Johannesburg Art Gallery. In your work, you've investigated the behavioural impact of defensive architecture in Johannesburg. How do you approach revealing or unsettling these embedded power dynamics in your installations or public interventions? And how can artists today avoid simply replicating the trauma they're trying to reveal? And I'll just repeat the last part of that question again, so you can think it through. I'm working on intervening in the Johannesburg Art Gallery. In your work, you've investigated the behavioural impact of defensive architecture in Johannesburg. How do you approach revealing or unsettling these embedded power dynamics in your installations or public interventions? And how can artists today avoid simply replicating the trauma they're trying to reveal? There's another question after that, but let's start with that one.
So, okay, I'm just going to fixate on the trauma thing. I mean, and I might be, no, let me go the other way. Let me start with the earlier stuff. First of all, when I look at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, I think it is a bunker installation of some kind. It's like a vault. It feels like an impenetrable building. And it suffered from that kind of tension since '94, but even earlier. What's the right entrance? Where should you be guided? All that kind of stuff. So this business of collapsing it, opening it up, creating some level of transparency in the basement space that I was working in, I think in a very, very understated way is already a gesture towards that way of thinking about opening things up, about exploring beyond the buildings. Of course, my installations don't show much about the outside world and the condition of Joburg Park and the surrounding environment. But it's always there as a point of reflection. And I think there's a visceral anxiety about coming to Joburg Park that you have to shake off while you're at the JAG, and then you've got to like suck it all up to get back into that space. That's just one probably not very interesting answer. But this business of repeating trauma, I'm not sure I fully understand how I can respond to that question. The only thing I can think of when wanting to make work about the Johannesburg Art Gallery, let's say, wanting to make work about the city of Johannesburg, there is so much of it. There is so much written about it. There are so many installations and interventions and performances. What we've seen over the last 30 years is just remarkable in terms of the output of thinking and production, and very special projects within the gallery itself. I think it really comes down to what is particular about your inquiry. So is this, where do you situate yourself within this exploration? And within that, you might perhaps be able to understand what is acceptable as repetition, because you can defend it from your singular perspective, whether you're defending it with theory and all of that stuff as well, that's fine. But if you can carve that line that is predicated on, honestly, on your subjectivity, your limitations within that, you might start to find a mirror to the subjectivity that the Johannesburg Art Gallery represents as a dead space, as no longer a representation of a functional colonial institution. And if anything, actually, a space for imagining a kind of cannibalization, which I think is intrinsic to the way we read the city of Johannesburg. We know it to have been doing that since it was born, reinventing itself every generation, sometimes every 15, 20 years. It's a fast-paced condition. And now I'm rambling, so I'm not sure that I'm answering your question, because I feel like there were a lot of ideas there. Maybe we should have a side chat at some point. Sorry, I can't be more helpful right now. You caught me a bit on the spot.
No, I think it's a really lovely, thoughtful question, and I think you gave it a good.
I agree.
Ranging response. And Joanne has a sort of extension to her question, which is that given your background in visual art and your transition into urbanism and cross-disciplinary work, what advice would you give to someone at the edge of both art and architecture, trying to honor the intuitive and the academic?
Yeah. So the power of the intuitive is that typically when you're in the making process and you are at that, the mark making is at, I'm saying metaphorically mark making, but even the actual mark making, when it is happening at a non-verbal, unself-conscious level, and you are conscious of that unself-consciousness, is when you are probably in the sweet spot. In other words, when can I create the conditions for me not to think about the thinking of the thing I'm doing? This is a very important part of practice, I find, because otherwise you're overthinking the why and all that kind of stuff. And actually, when you are working with media, collage painting, photography, moving image, whatever, I strongly feel that then you do need to understand how, at the technical level, those things perform in service of what you're trying to achieve. So if you don't understand the medium that you are working in physically, like its tactileness and how it can be manipulated, it's very, very difficult to then transition the link between the intuitive perhaps to the conceptual or otherwise. The academic thing, I think it's very important to read. I think it's very, very important to research. I think it's very important to frame and understand and frame your ideas in as coherent and clear a way. But I think that is ultimately the death of art, to overdo that. And I've seen it in one sees it all over the place, all over the world. It's as if we've lost our sense of making. And I'm not elevating making. I'm just saying this is part of practice. This is part about being fit. You have to be able to get the hands and the mind and that extension of the intuitive in play in order for you to find, for want of a better description, the magic, the moments where contact is made between a thought, between the hand, between medium, that then solicits it frees itself of all of that other stuff. And that is when you can start to shape and construct meaning, if you will, towards an argument around a shift in design, around a shift in representation, around the fact that you don't buy any of these languages that I'm describing, and you actually want things to be seen in this particular way, but you need to know what it is you want people to see and how you are going to travel them to that point.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Again, another thoughtful response. And thank you for that equally thoughtful prompt from you, Joanne. And Joanne has also said she's absolutely down for a chat. I think you had suggested that, so I'm sure that the two of you can get together. And then just one more comment. I think before we close off, I don't think there are any more questions or hands up. Bronwyn Miller says, "Oh, I am elevating making." Cryptic, but I think it's kind of sequitur from what you've been talking about. She said, "If you are an artist, you must make, you must work with materials and use your hands and eyes." And I think that's pretty nice fitting end to the presentation this evening. So Stephen, thank you so much. I know we're going to be seeing you around the school, so I appreciate your continuing contribution to the discussions we have here about architecture and about creative cultural production in general. And I think it's been a really insightful view into your mind and your own formation and work. So I'd like to thank you for sharing your work with us this evening.
Well, Mark, thanks so much. Thanks to Boitumelo for pulling this all together from a technical point of view, and to the 56, that does include some of your team, Mark, persons present tonight. I really appreciate your time and your attendance. Thanks for listening to me. I enjoyed putting this together. It was a real privilege. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, good. There was quite a few more than that, actually. I think they just sort of taper off when it comes to the Q&A sometimes. But no, thank you. It was really good. So yeah, thanks a lot. And just a reminder that the next practice lecture is going to be by Lerato Bereng from the Stevenson Gallery.
and that is going to take place on the 10th of June. So we're looking forward to that very much. Loretta will talk about the gallery and her work and her own formation and arrival as a curator and as a director of the gallery, of the Stevenson Gallery. So that's on the 10th of June. I know the team here have posted in the chat the CPD certification form. You just click on the link. If you click on that, I think the instructions are self-explanatory, and we'll be back in touch with you to certify your attendance. So thank you all for attending, and looking forward to seeing you all on the 10th of June and for the rollout of the rest of the series. Thank you.